The snows beyond the wall never rested. The wind cut through flesh like knives, and the frozen earth felt more like the graveyard of forgotten men than the land of the living. Jon Snow had seen death countless times, but on this day, standing before the Night King and his silent army, he felt something different. Not terror, not even despair, something deeper, a pull, like the invisible weight of destiny pressing down on his chest. He had come here to kill them, to end the long night once and for all. The sword of his father, or the man he thought his father was, rested heavy in his hand, flames licking at the Valyrian steel. Yet as the Night King's piercing blue eyes fixed on him, Jon felt the fire in Longclaw flicker as if it too questioned his next move. The army of the dead stood motionless, their rotten flesh still and quiet. Not one step forward, not one sound. They waited, like soldiers before a general. The Night King raised his pale hand, but not to attack. Instead, he held it out, palm open, as if offering Jon something unseen. For a heartbeat, Jon felt madness creeping in. Could it be a trick? A trap to make him hesitate? He had dreamed of this confrontation, prepared for it, suffered endless losses to reach this exact moment. But something in those icy eyes spoke of truth, twisted, dark, but truth nonetheless. What if it doesn't have to be this way? Jon whispered to himself. Memories of Daenerys burned into his mind. Her fire, her promises, her desperation. He remembered the lords of Westeros squabbling like children while the true war loomed. He remembered his men falling in blood-soaked snow, clawed down by an enemy that felt more inevitable than winter itself. And suddenly he wondered, what if fighting them was never the way? The Night King tilted his head as if sensing Jon's thoughts. The silence grew unbearable, the cold searing his lungs. Then for the first time, Jon felt a voice in his head. It wasn't spoken, it was pressed into his skull, ancient and hollow. You fight for a world that will betray you. We fight for silence. Join us. Jon's knees nearly buckled at the force of it. He gritted his teeth, trying to push back against the voice, but his heart betrayed him. Had he not already seen betrayal enough? From Catelyn's cold disdain, to the knives in his own brother's hands, to Daenerys turning into the very tyrant he swore to fight against. Could the dead really be worse? The snow howled harder, and Jon realized every pair of blue eyes in that army was locked on him, waiting, expecting. Longclaw's flames dimmed to embers, almost extinguished. His breath came in sharp bursts, each one burning his chest. If I refuse? Jon asked the Night King aloud, though he wasn't sure if his voice even carried in this frozen stillness. Then you die, and your people with you. All men, all women, all children. Their screams will drown out the songs of your bards. The truth was cruel, but undeniable. Jon had seen how unstoppable they were. Even if he killed this creature before him, more would come. The cycle would never end. But what if the cycle could be broken by bending instead of breaking? Jon lowered Longclaw. The flame vanished in an instant, the steel turning black under the dying light. A shiver rippled through the ranks of the dead, a motionless wave of approval. The Night King stepped closer, face unreadable. And for a moment Jon thought he saw something in those frozen eyes. Not just death, but memory, loss, pain older than kingdoms. As their gazes locked, Jon felt the cold seep into his bones, replacing the fire he once carried. His breath turned ragged, then slow. The Night King reached forward, pressing one finger against Jon's chest, just above his heart. No pain, no wound, only silence. A silence so complete it felt holy. The wind died. The dead bowed their heads. Jon Snow, once Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, once the bastard of Winterfell, once the would-be savior of the living, was no longer of the living, and yet he breathed. Somewhere deep inside, the man remained. But around him surged an endless tide of power and stillness. He wasn't the Night King. He wasn't Jon Snow. He was something else, something in between, something new. The army had a new master, and for the first time in his life, Jon wondered if he had finally found a purpose that no man could take from him. The army marched in silence. The only sound was the crunch of frost under countless feet, a rhythm that seemed to echo the beat of Jon's altered heart. He walked at the front, beside the Night King, though the lines between them had blurred. He was no longer simply Jon Snow, nor entirely their prisoner. He was something in command, something chosen. Every step away from the wall felt like betrayal. His mind whispered names: Sam, Arya, Sansa, Ghost. He imagined their faces when they saw him standing beside the very enemy he had sworn to destroy. But deeper still, another voice whispered back, "They will never understand you." They never did. The Night King did not speak often, but Jon felt him always, like a shadow cast on the inside of his skull. The living fight to rule, the dead fight to end the fight. That is why you belong with us. Jon wanted to resist, to cling to the warmth of the past. But then he remembered Daenerys burning innocents in the streets of King's Landing, remembered Cersei's smirk as she toyed with lives, remembered the endless betrayals of men who cared more for crowns than survival. He clenched his jaw. Was it betrayal, or was it justice to abandon them? The army reached its first village 3 nights later. Snow buried the huts, smoke still curling from chimneys, children's laughter muffled behind doors. The dead circled like wolves around sheep, waiting for their new commander's word. Jon stood still, his breath cold mist. The Night King's icy gaze turned to him. This was his test. Jon raised a hand, trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of decision. Every instinct from the man he used to be screamed to protect these people. Yet the silence of the dead inside him urged another path. He stepped forward, his voice calm, cold. No killing. The army froze. The Night King's head tilted in quiet amusement. Jon swallowed. We don't need slaughter. Fear will serve us better. The whites lowered their weapons but did not disperse. Instead, they stood unmoving, blue eyes glowing in the dark. The villagers peered out, pale faces pressed to windows, seeing an army of nightmares standing in silence before them. The message was clear. You are alive because we allow it. That night, Jon walked among the dead, testing the limits of his power. When he thought of them stopping, they stopped. When he thought of them moving, they moved. He commanded them with will alone, and they obeyed. It was terrifying and intoxicating, but the whispers never stopped. Inside him, the dead were always there, murmuring in languages older than kingdoms, voices like frost on glass. They spoke of betrayal, of men who had once broken promises, of rulers who had cast them aside. Jon realized then that the Night King and his army were not born of cruelty. They were born of betrayal. The first men had made them, used them, then cursed them. Their vengeance was not mindless. Jon lay awake, staring into the black sky. Was he truly leading them, or were they reshaping him into something that fit their design? His thoughts were broken by the sound of wings. Above the frozen village, a dragon's shadow passed. Rhaegal. Jon's heart lurched. The beast circled, roaring into the night, green fire flaring against the snow. And on its back, Daenerys. Her silver hair whipped in the wind, her eyes searching the ground. When they fell on Jon, her face twisted, a mix of shock and fury. The dead did not flinch at the dragon's fire. They stood unbothered, their blue eyes reflecting the flames. Jon stepped forward into the open. His heart thudded with conflict. "Jon!" Daenerys shouted from above, her voice raw, carried by the wind. "What are you doing?" Jon wanted to answer, but what words could explain this choice? That he had not turned traitor but savior in a different shape? That he believed unity with the dead was the only path forward? Rhaegal roared again, fire dripping from his jaws, ready to incinerate the entire army. The dead raised their heads in unison, prepared to meet flame with silence. The Night King did not move. He simply looked at Jon, as if daring him to make his first true command. And Jon, torn between the fire he once loved and the silence that had claimed him, raised his hand. The dragon's eyes met his, and to Daenerys' horror, Rhaegal faltered, fire choking in his throat, as if the beast itself was bound by Jon's new will. Her scream split the night, a sound of betrayal so sharp it cut deeper than any blade. For the first time since he crossed that line in the snow, Jon felt the full weight of what he had chosen. He had become the bridge between the living and the dead. But bridges, he knew, always carried the risk of burning. torches. He knew always carried the risk of burning. Daenerys's eyes burned brighter than dragonfire as she stared down at Jon. Her face was twisted with fury, disbelief, and something deeper, betrayal so raw it seemed to bleed into the night. The man she had trusted, the man she had loved, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the very enemy she had sworn to burn from the earth. Jon Snow. Her voice thundered over the howling wind. "What have you done?" Jon didn't answer. His throat locked tight, his chest a battlefield of war cries and whispers. Behind him, the army of the dead remained still, their glowing eyes casting ghostly light across the snow. Rhaegal shifted uneasily in the air, torn between fire and silence, wings thrashing against the storm. "Answer me," Daenerys demanded, her voice cracking. Jon finally spoke, his words heavy, deliberate. "I chose survival," she laughed, a bitter, broken laugh that echoed across the frozen fields. "Survival? You stand with death itself." "I stand with the only force that cannot betray me," Jon shot back, his voice louder now, anger spilling through his calm. "The living will never unite." "I have seen it. You have seen it. Men will burn cities before they bend their pride. But the dead, they follow, they obey. They cannot be corrupted." The dragon roared again, spewing fire into the sky, but Jon lifted his hand. The flame faltered, curling into smoke. Rhaegal's growl turned to a strained whimper as his wings faltered, and Daenerys clutched tighter to her saddle, staring at Jon in disbelief. "You can't." Her voice was trembling now, horrified. "You can't control them. You're not him." "You're not?" "I'm not him," Jon interrupted, nodding toward the Night King, who stood silent and watchful like a shadow beside him. "And I'm not you either. I'm something else." Her eyes narrowed to slits, rage rising to meet the cold wind. "No, you are lost." She yanked Rhaegal upward, forcing the dragon free of Jon's unseen grip. The beast roared defiantly, green fire lighting up the stars, and with one last look of pure hatred, Daenerys turned her dragon south, flying back toward Winterfell. The silence that followed was heavier than snow. The dead stared forward, awaiting command. The Night King's gaze lingered on Jon, unreadable as always, yet there was something new there, approval, perhaps even pride. Jon, though, felt no pride, only dread. He had wanted to prove that this path was survival, not damnation. But Daenerys' scream still echoed in his skull, louder than the whispers of the dead. When the army moved again, their steps carried a message. The world would hear of what Daenerys saw. The North would hear. The South would hear. And when they did, Jon knew he would no longer be the hero they once believed him to be. He would be the monster at their gates. Days later, the dead reached the first northern stronghold, Last Hearth, home of House Umber. Smoke curled from chimneys. Guards patrolled the walls, and children played in the snow. Unaware of the doom approaching, Jon stopped the army before the gates. The dead stood like statues behind him, endless and still. The Umbers scrambled to prepare, horns blaring, men arming themselves in panic. But when they saw Jon Snow standing at the front of the undead host, their confusion outweighed their fear. "Lord Snow," one of them shouted from the battlements, "is it truly you?" Jon stepped forward, hood drawn back, his face pale but alive. His voice carried strong. "It is me. Open your gates. No harm will come to you." Whispers spread like fire among the defenders. Some cried treachery. Others wept in relief, clinging to the memory of Jon as their protector. The dead did not move, did not attack. Their stillness itself was more terrifying than war. Finally, the gates creaked open. Jon entered alone, leaving the dead outside. The Umbers crowded him, demanding answers, their eyes darting to the unnatural army beyond their walls. Jon met them with the only truth he had. "I have ended the war with death. They are mine to command. No White Walker will ever touch this land again." The room erupted in outrage and disbelief. Some called him a savior. Others spat at his feet. Children cried, their mothers clutching them tightly, as if his very presence poisoned the air. And then the old lord of the house, wrinkled and tired, spoke above the noise. "Boy, if you command them, then you are not our Jon Snow. You are something else. And something else is never trusted. The words pierce deeper than any blade. That night, Jon sat alone in the Umber's hall, firelight flickering against the shadows. The whispers of the dead pressed in harder, filling the silence. Outside, his army waited, patient as ever. But inside, Jon felt the line between himself and them blur more with every passing breath. He had chosen survival, but already survival felt like damnation. Word traveled faster than ravens. By the time Jon and his army reached the edge of Winterfell's lands, the north was already buzzing with whispers of betrayal. Some said Jon Snow had been bewitched by the Night King. Others swore he had died and returned a monster. But the most common whisper was the cruelest. Jon Snow had chosen the dead over his own blood. At Winterfell, the tension was a storm barely held back by stone walls. Sansa Stark stood in the great hall, her face pale but unshaken, her eyes sharp as glass. Arya lingered in the shadows, her hand resting on Needle's hilt, silent but deadly as always. Bran sat in his chair, gaze distant, eyes clouded as though he had already seen what was coming. Daenerys was there too, pacing like a caged dragon, her fury unchecked. "He's lost to us," she hissed, her silver hair flying as she turned on Sansa. "You saw what I saw. He commands them. He controls dragons. He is no longer a man." Sansa's jaw tightened. "He is my brother. Your brother is dead." Daenerys snapped, slamming her hand on the table. "What stands before us now is something else. If you cannot see that, then you are blind." Arya finally spoke, her voice low and cutting. "He's still Jon. If he meant to destroy us, Winterfell would already be ashes. He could have let the dead swarm us while we slept. But he didn't. That doesn't make him safe," Daenerys shot back. Her eyes blazed, the memory of Jon stopping Rhaegal's fire still a wound too fresh to hide. "If he can turn dragons against me, then he is more dangerous than the Night King ever was." Bran's voice cut through the argument, cold and distant. "He stands between two worlds now. Not living, not dead, a bridge. But bridges collapse when the weight becomes too much." The hall fell silent at his words. For the first time, Daenerys had no immediate retort. Even Sansa faltered, her sharp tongue restrained by the gravity in Bran's tone. Arya's hand gripped her sword tighter, as if she already prepared for the day she'd be forced to use it against him. Outside, the horns blew. Jon Snow had come home. Winterfell's gates trembled as the army of the dead appeared on the horizon, their blue eyes flickering like lanterns in the dusk. The living lined the walls, bows drawn, torches ready, fear dripping off them like sweat. They had fought these creatures before, seen them rip men apart, and now they stood motionless at Jon's command. At the front, he rode a black horse, Ghost, padding silently beside him. His fur white as the snow, and eyes glowing the same icy blue as the army behind them. That sight broke the hearts of many who had once cheered his name. To see even Ghost, the loyal direwolf, claimed by whatever Jon had become, it was too much for some to bear. Jon halted before the gates, pulling back his hood. His face was pale, worn, but still Jon. His eyes, though dark, glimmered faintly with something unnatural, as if ice lived behind the brown. "Sansa, Arya," he called out, his voice carrying through the icy air. "It's me." Sansa stood on the battlements, her face unreadable, but her hands clenched into fists. Arya leaned forward, her expression torn between hope and fury. Daenerys stood beside them, her hand gripping the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. "Do not believe him. He is not yours anymore." Jon's gaze flicked to her, then back to Sansa. "I have not come to fight. I have come to warn you. The South will march on you when they hear of me. Cersei will not waste this chance. She will paint you as allies of the dead. But if you stand with me, we can end all of it." "End?" Arya shouted back, anger in her voice. "By becoming what we've always fought against?" "No," Jon answered, his tone steady. "By making sure no one else has to fight at all." The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Sansa spoke, her voice calm but laced with steel. "And what price do you ask us to pay for this peace, Jon?" Jon's expression softened, a flicker of the man he once was breaking through the frost. "Trust. Nothing more." Daenerys' laugh was sharp and cruel. "Trust? You bring an army of corpses to our gates and demand trust? You've lost your mind." She turned to the soldiers along the wall. "Loose your arrows. Kill him before he kills us all." But Sansa raised her hand. "No," her voice carried firm authority. "Not yet," Daenerys spun on, her eyes ablaze. "If you will not act, I will." She stormed away, already calling for Rhaegal, fury spilling from her like fire, waiting for release. On the walls, Arya's eyes never left Jon. She searched his face for lies, for weakness, for some sign of her brother beneath the frost. And for one fleeting second, she thought she saw him, the boy who once told her she could be anything, even a swordsman. But just as quickly, the moment passed. Winterfell stood divided, and in the shadows of the walls, Bran's eyes rolled back into white, seeing what none of them yet could: the cost of choosing to trust Jon Snow, and the darker cost of choosing not to. The night after Jon's arrival at Winterfell, the castle was a forge of whispers and firelight. Every hall buzzed with rumors. Half the soldiers believed Jon was cursed, half still clung to him as the North's true protector. But fear more than loyalty held the balance. Fear of Daenerys, fear of the dead standing silent beyond the gates, and fear of what Jon Snow had become. Daenerys did not sleep. She paced her chambers, rage gnawing at her like hunger. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Rhaegal faltering under Jon's command, his fire choking in his throat. It was the greatest humiliation she had ever suffered, and worse, it was at the hands of the man she once loved. To her, this was not a man who had chosen survival. It was a man who had betrayed her, betrayed the living, and betrayed the very idea of hope. She whispered to herself in High Valyrian, words sharp and cold as steel. "Fire will cleanse him. Fire will remind the North who their queen is." That dawn, Winterfell awoke to the roar of wings. Rhaegal descended from the clouds, shaking the stones with the force of his landing. His scales gleamed green in the morning light, smoke curling from his jaws. Daenerys sat high in the saddle, her hair whipping wild in the wind, her eyes fixed on Jon as he stood calmly before the gates. "Jon Snow!" she called, her voice slicing through the cold air. "This ends today. You will not stand at Winterfell's gates as a wolf draped in carrion. You will burn, and with you this mockery of life you command." Sansa stood on the battlements, her face pale but steady. Arya lingered beside her, hand on her blade, watching every movement. Bran sat silent in his chair, though his eyes betrayed the faint flicker of something darker. Jon raised his hand, signaling his army to remain still. Thousands of blue eyes glowed faintly in the snow, silent, patient. The sight of them unmoving shook the northern soldiers more than any charge. "Daenerys," Jon said, his voice calm but carrying across the courtyard. "Do this, and you will prove me right. You will prove that the living will always choose fire and death over peace." Her teeth clenched, her knuckles white on the reins. "There can be no peace with the dead. You of all men should know that." "I know better than anyone," Jon replied. His eyes flickered faintly, shadows of frost behind the brown. "And I know they follow, they obey. They are not bound by pride or greed. They will not betray me, as men have done all my life." His words echoed across Winterfell, and for a moment, silence fell. Some of the northern soldiers lowered their bows, confusion etched into their faces. They remembered Jon Snow, the man who had died for them, the man who had led them into battle against Ramsay, the man who had been their shield in the dark. Could such a man truly have forsaken them? Daenerys' face twisted with fury at their hesitation. "Do not listen to him. He has become what we fought to destroy." Then she gave the word. "Dracarys!" Rhaegal roared, green fire spilling from his throat, hurtling down toward Jon and the front line of the dead. The heat seared the snow, the flames swallowing the air. The northerners on the walls screamed, believing they were about to see Jon Snow consumed in dragonfire. But Jon did not move. He raised his hand. The fire split in mid-air, curling around him like waves breaking against rock. The heat licked at his cloak, but did not touch him. The dead stood untouched, the fire parting as if the air itself obeyed him. Gasps erupted from the walls. Even Arya stepped back in shock. Sansa's lips parted, her face drained of blood. Daenerys' scream was wild, a sound of rage and disbelief. She yanked Rhaegal higher, forcing the dragon to circle for another strike. But Jon's eyes locked with hers, cold and unyielding. "Enough!" he commanded. The dragon faltered mid-air, its wings jerking, its roar turning to a strangled cry. For a heartbeat, Rhaegal hovered between fire and silence, torn by two masters. Then with a shudder he landed before Jon, lowering his massive head in submission. The dead did not cheer. They never did. But their stillness shifted, as if the world itself bowed. Daenerys stared down, her face white with horror. Her dragon, her child, bent its head to Jon Snow. And in that moment, the fragile alliance within Winterfell shattered. Half the men on the walls fell to their knees, hailing Jon as their true king, their true savior. The other half recoiled in terror, muttering of sorcery and curses. Arya's hand tightened on Needle. Her eyes never left Jon, but for the first time, she did not know if she was looking at her brother or at the doom that would end them all. Sansa's face hardened like stone. "The North will not survive this," she whispered to herself. Bran's voice came, flat, almost bored, but filled with an ominous weight. "The choice has already been made." Winterfell trembled, not from dragonfire, not from the dead, but from the fracture splitting its heart in two. And Jon Snow stood in the center of it, no longer wolf, no longer crow, no longer man, something else entirely. Winterfell was no longer a fortress of stone and honor. It had become a nest of suspicion, divided loyalties and quiet rebellion. The great hall that once echoed with songs of victory now buzzed with whispers. Every word soaked in fear. Half of the North bent the knee to Jon. To them, he was still the man who bled for their freedom, the man who had faced death countless times and returned stronger. They called him the only one who could keep them safe, for even death itself obeyed him. The other half looked on in terror, muttering curses of dark magic and sorcery. To them, Jon was no Stark, no savior. He was the very monster they had sworn to fight. Mothers clutched their children when he passed, men spat on the ground, priests prayed to the old gods to strike him down. And in the shadows, Daenerys seethed. Her dragon, her child, knelt to him. Her armies hesitated when his name was spoken. And worse, Sansa Stark refused to declare where her loyalty lay. To Daenerys, that silence was betrayal itself. One night, she stormed into Sansa's chamber, fire in her eyes. "You think you can balance on the edge of this blade forever? Choose him or choose me. If you will not stand with me, then I will burn him and this castle with dragonfire until there is nothing left to save." Sansa did not flinch. Her hands were folded neatly before her, her eyes cold as winter stone. "You would burn Winterfell, the home of my ancestors, because you cannot control one man. Then you are no queen of mine." The words cut sharper than Valyrian steel. Daenerys trembled with fury, but said nothing more. She left the room, her silence a promise of fire. Meanwhile, Arya watched Jon from the shadows, as she had always watched the truth in men's hearts. He moved like Jon, spoke like Jon, but there was something missing in his eyes. She tried to find the warmth that once glowed there. The brother who had smiled when he gave her needle, but she found only frost. One evening she approached him in the Godswood, where the heart tree's red leaves whispered in the wind. Ghost lingered at his side, eyes glowing faint blue. "You're scaring them," Arya said, her voice flat but heavy with unspoken grief. Jon didn't look at her. "I'm protecting them. By standing with corpses?" Her hand brushed the hilt of her sword. "By bending dragons? Tell me, Jon, are you still my brother, or are you just another king who thinks he knows best?" Jon's jaw tightened. He turned to her, and for the briefest moment, Arya saw the old Jon, the tired, honest man who hated crowns and games. But then the cold flickered in his gaze again, and her heart sank. "I don't want crowns," Jon said. "I don't want thrones. I want to end this cycle. No more kings, no more wars, no more betrayals. Only silence, peace." Arya's hand lingered on her sword. "Peace that smells like a graveyard." before Jon could answer, Bran rolled forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on him. The dead whisper louder through you every day. You believe you command them, but it is they who command you. You are becoming their voice, not their master. Jon's face darkened, his jaw clenching. If I am their voice, then maybe it is time the living listened. The air grew cold, the heart tree's branches swaying, though no wind touched them. Arya's grip on Needle tightened, torn between her oath to protect her brother and her duty to kill monsters. But Bran's voice broke the tension. You will choose soon, Arya, him or the world. That night, Daenerys gathered her closest advisors in secret. Tyrion pleaded with her to seek another way, but her patience was ash turned to dust. He has stolen my dragon, she hissed. He has stolen my people's faith. If I let him live, I am nothing. Tomorrow I will strike. He will burn, and all who follow him will burn with him. Outside, beneath the frozen walls, the dead stood still. But their silence was not emptiness. It was anticipation. Jon Snow lay awake in his chambers, the whispers louder than ever, filling his mind with promises and warnings. He thought of Arya's eyes, of Sansa's silence, of Daenerys' fury. He knew the storm was coming. Not from the south, not from the dead, but from within Winterfell's very heart. And for the first time, Jon wondered if survival would demand not just the betrayal of others, but the betrayal of himself. The dawn of the next day bled red across the snow, though no blood had yet been spilled. Winterfell stood restless, soldiers on edge, families huddled in silence, and the dead lined up like statues beyond the walls. The castle itself seemed to sense what was coming, like a beast that knows a storm is about to break. Jon Snow stood in the courtyard, calm as stone, Ghost at his side, eyes faintly glowing. The whispers pressed heavy in his skull, but he had learned to live with them. They no longer felt like chains, but like a chorus, pushing him towards something greater. Still, his heart, what was left of it, ached. He knew what Daenerys would do, and she did not keep him waiting. The roar of wings shattered the morning silence. Rhaegal descended from the clouds, his shadow swallowing the courtyard, his green fire already spilling from his jaws. Daenerys sat high in the saddle, her face pale with fury, her silver hair a storm around her. Jon Snow! Her voice cracked like thunder. You will not poison this land with your lies and corpses. Today Winterfell is cleansed in fire. The walls trembled with panic. Soldiers screamed, some raising bows, others dropping them in terror. Families fled deeper into the castle, the air already hot from the dragon's breath. Jon raised his voice, steady and firm. Daenerys, don't do this. You'll burn the very people you claim to save. You are not a savior, she spat, her face twisted with grief and rage. You are the same as the Night King, an enemy of the living. The dragon roared. The dead stood motionless. And then chaos erupted. Rhaegal unleashed his fire. Green flames poured down, swallowing the courtyard in a storm of heat and smoke. Soldiers screamed, stone cracked, wood splintered. But where the fire touched Jon and his dead, it bent and twisted, parting like water around stone. The courtyard became two worlds, the living burning, the dead untouched. On the walls, Arya shouted, "She'll kill us all!" Her hand gripped Needle, her eyes darting between Daenerys in the sky and Jon below. Sansa's face was pale, torn between fury and fear. "Stop her! Stop them both!" she cried, but her voice was drowned by the chaos. Then Bran spoke, his voice sharp and heavy, cutting through the noise like a blade. This is the moment. His eyes rolled back, and for a heartbeat it seemed the weirwood trees themselves shuddered in the godswood. Choose wolf or dragon, living or dead. Arya leapt from the wall, rolling into the courtyard, flames hissing around her. She charged toward Jon, needle in hand, her face a mask of fury and grief. "Jon!" she screamed. "If you are still, you prove it. End this." Jon's heart split in two. He saw the sister he loved, the sister who once ran to him with tears and laughter. But the whispers clawed louder. "Kill the fire, silence the betrayal, end the cycle." "Stay your hand, Arya," Jon said, his voice breaking. "I can stop her, but not if you stand against me." Above them, Daenerys circled again, her face a storm of madness.
Kill him, Arya!
Kill the monster before he takes you too. Arya froze, torn, needle trembling in her grip. Her eyes flicked between Jon and the dragon above, and in that frozen second, Jon made his choice. He thrust out his hand, his eyes flashing with frost. Rhaegal faltered mid-air, wings jerking, his roar turning strangled. Daenerys clutched the saddle, screaming as her dragon buckled beneath her. "No!" she cried, pulling desperately at the reins. But Rhaegal shuddered, then dropped, his massive body crashing into the snow just beyond the gates. Daenerys was thrown, tumbling into the snow, her crown of fury shattered by the fall. Soldiers rushed to her side, while others stared at Jon, horror and awe painted across their faces. Arya's eyes widened, tears brimming but refusing to fall. "You've done it," she whispered. "You've taken everything, even her dragons." Jon stepped forward, his face pale, his voice shaking but resolute. "It was her or all of us. I chose us." Sansa descended from the battlements, her eyes sharp as knives. "You chose power, Jon. You can dress it in mercy, but it is still power. And power in the north has always been cursed." The courtyard stilled. Daenerys was pulled to her feet, her fury blazing hotter than any fire. She pointed at Jon, her voice hoarse but unyielding. "He is the end of us all. Kill him or kneel to him, but do not stand idle." The north fractured in an instant. Half the soldiers drew their blades for Jon, half for Daenerys. Shouts rose, steel clashed, blood spilled on the snow. Winterfell became a battlefield, torn apart by wolf and dragon. Arya stood frozen in the middle, needle in her hand, her heart breaking with every scream. And Bran, his eyes still white, whispered words none could hear but the trees. "The dead are patient, but the living are their own undoing." Winterfell was fire and frost, chaos tearing through its ancient stones. The great courtyard became a battlefield of kin and kin. Steel clashing against steel, screams echoing into the cold sky. The dead stood like statues at first, unmoving, watching as the living tore each other apart. But when Jon lifted his hand, they moved, not to kill, but to surround, forming walls of silent flesh, pressing the living tighter into madness. Daenerys fought like a storm reborn, her silver hair wild, her voice hoarse with rage, as she commanded what men she had left. For the living. "For the Queen!" she cried, her eyes never leaving Jon. She looked broken and beautiful all at once, fire burning in her soul, even as her dragon lay crippled in the snow behind her. Jon moved through the chaos with Ghost at his side, his presence alone bending men to his will. Soldiers who once cursed him now dropped their swords in awe, bowing to the cold king who could not be burned, who commanded death itself. Others spat at him and rushed with blades, but their steel shattered against the tide of silence that followed in his wake. Arya was everywhere, striking like a shadow, her blade a whisper of vengeance. But her target was not soldiers, not Daenerys, not Jon. Her target was hesitation itself. She fought to carve a path to him, her eyes wide with fury and grief. Every step closer twisted her heart, but she had sworn once to kill monsters. And now she could not tell if Jon Snow was her brother or her last monster to slay. Sansa stood at the battlements, her voice carrying like a queen's, rallying those who had not yet chosen. "Protect the north! Protect Winterfell!" she cried, though she did not name Jon nor Daenerys. Her silence was her weapon, letting others bleed for their choices while she calculated survival. Bran sat unmoving in the godswood, yet his voice echoed in Jon's head, calm and distant. "The bridge is breaking. The dead pull one way, the living another. You cannot be both." Jon staggered in the snow, the whispers of the dead screaming inside his skull, louder than the clash of battle. They urged him to silence everything, to still the chaos, to bring peace in the only way they knew, death. Daenerys charged through the fire and smoke, her sword drawn, her face streaked with ash and blood. She came for Jon, her scream raw, her fury blinding. "You stole my dragon. You stole my destiny." Jon caught her blade with his, their faces inches apart. For a heartbeat, they were not king and queen, Not ice and fire, but man and woman who once loved each other. He saw the fire in her eyes. She saw the frost in his. And both knew there was no path left back to what they once were. "You'll burn them all," Jon said, his voice low and broken. "And you'll freeze them all," she hissed back. The clash rang out again. Steel against steel, sparks hissing in the snow. Arya burst through the melee, her blade poised, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst. She saw Jon and Daenerys locked in their final struggle and raised needle high, ready to end it. For the first time, Jon looked at her, not as an enemy, not as a threat, but as the little sister he had loved since the days of Winterfell's quiet halls. His eyes softened just for a moment, just long enough for Arya to see him. She froze. Her hand shook. Needle hovered, trembling, and in that hesitation the choice was made for her. Jon twisted Daenerys' sword from her hand, but instead of killing her, he thrust his palm forward. A wave of silence rippled outward, the whispers roaring through him, and Daenerys collapsed to the ground, gasping, her body trembling as though the life had been sucked from her lungs. She did not die, but the fire in her eyes dimmed, her strength drained, the battle stilled. Men dropped their swords, staring in horror at the queen on her knees, powerless, and the man who commanded the dead. Jon stood above them all, his chest heaving, his face pale and lined with grief. His voice rang out louder than the storm. No more kings, no more queens, no more thrones. The living and the dead will serve one cause. Silence, peace. The dead bowed in unison. Half the living fell to their knees. The other half wept, cursing him as the end of the world. Arya lowered her sword, her hand trembling. She wanted to strike, to end it, but she could not. She saw too much of her brother in that broken figure, too much of the boy who once smiled at her with warmth. Sansa's face was carved of ice, her eyes sharp as daggers. She knew the North was lost, not to fire, not to foreign queens, but to her own blood. Bran's voice whispered like the rustle of the weirwood leaves. The song of ice and fire is over. What remains is silence, and so it was. Jon Snow, no longer wolf, no longer crow, no longer man, stood as the bridge between life and death. Not king, not savior, not monster, something else. And as Winterfell knelt or wept, the long night did not fall in fire or frost. It fell in silence. Fall in fire or frost. It fell in silence.